Which brings us to the moment Earth's leadership had to choose their path. The Zerithian fleet hung in orbit like an unspoken question. Their weapon systems powered up but not yet activated, their commanders waiting for the predictable response they'd received from 17 previous civilizations. Earth's defense network was fully operational but holding its fire, the entire solar system tense with unspent energy. The decision about how to respond wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical, defining what kind of civilization humanity would become in the galactic community. Dr. Elena Vasquez in Colorado laid out the practical options during that emergency council session. Her analysis cut through the emotional responses and strategic calculations with clinical precision. She presented two clear pathways forward, each with different implications for humanity's future relationships with every other species they might encounter. The room full of military leaders, scientists, and diplomats understood they weren't just deciding how to handle this particular invasion attempt. They were setting precedent for centuries of interstellar relations. Option 1 involved demonstrating just enough capability to convince the Zerithians to leave without further escalation. This approach would involve targeted shows of force, perhaps disabling a few scout ships without casualties, demonstrating precision targeting capabilities, or temporarily disrupting their communications in ways that suggested greater power waiting to be unleashed. The advantage was clean resolution with minimal collateral damage and no guaranteed retaliation. They could make their point without provoking a wider conflict or drawing attention from other potentially aggressive civilizations. Clean, simple minimal escalation meant they could return to their previous level of preparedness without alerting the wider galaxy to their full capabilities. They'd maintain their defensive advantage as a hidden asset rather than making a public declaration of power. The risk was that other civilizations might still see Earth as a potential target if they only demonstrated limited defensive capacity. The Zerithians might withdraw but could return with reinforcements, or share intelligence that would make Earth vulnerable to other threats. Option 2 required demonstrating enough capability to convince everyone in the galaxy that attacking Earth was a catastrophically bad idea. This approach would involve full activation of their distributed defense network in a coordinated display of overwhelming force. They'd show the asteroid belt installations repositioning for system-wide coverage, the orbital platforms coordinating complex firing solutions, the ground-based systems integrating with space-based assets. The demonstration would leave no doubt about Earth's defensive capabilities while minimizing actual casualties. This wasn't just about surviving this encounter with one invasion fleet. The broader implications stretched across potential future interactions with dozens of civilizations that might view Earth as either threat or opportunity. A limited demonstration might solve the immediate problem, but leave them vulnerable to future aggression from other directions. A comprehensive show of force could establish deterrence across known space, but might also mark them as a potential threat that needed containment by multiple civilizations. It was about defining humanity's role in galactic politics for centuries to come. Would they be the civilization that hid its capabilities and avoided attention, or the one that established clear red lines through demonstrated power? The decision would influence how other species approached diplomacy, trade, scientific cooperation, and military planning involving Earth. Their choice would signal whether humanity preferred isolation or engagement, secrecy or transparency, reaction or prevention. They had to deter aggression without falling into the imperial expansion trap that had consumed so many other spacefaring civilizations. History showed that demonstrating overwhelming power often led to arms races, preemptive strikes, and cycles of violence that eventually consumed the demonstrating power itself. The challenge was showing sufficient strength to prevent attack without appearing so threatening that others felt compelled to form alliances against them or launch preventive wars. The back and forth in that council session codified a central tension in interstellar relations that would echo through subsequent diplomatic interactions across multiple civilizations. The debate wasn't just about military capability, but about psychological impact, political perception, and long-term strategic positioning. Military leaders argued for clear demonstrations of force. Diplomats cautioned against creating permanent enemies. Scientists advocated for measured responses that could be escalated if necessary. How do you show strength without becoming what you're defending against? That question hung over the proceedings like a structural beam supporting the entire debate. Every proposed action was measured against this fundamental concern. Would this move make Earth safer in the short term, but more vulnerable in the long term? Would demonstrating their capabilities encourage peaceful cooperation or trigger aggressive responses? The decision required balancing immediate tactical advantage against strategic positioning in a galactic community they were only beginning to understand. The resolution emerged not from consensus but from calculated risk assessment. They recognized that hiding their capabilities would only invite future testing by other civilizations, while overwhelming demonstration might create the very threats they sought to avoid. The solution involved calibrated revelation, showing enough to establish credible deterrence while holding sufficient capability in reserve to handle escalated responses. So the Zerithians finally played their standard card. After hours of technical discussions and increasing frustration with Earth's unconventional responses, they fell back on the reliable intimidation tactics that had served them across 17 previous conquests. Their communications officer transmitted the formal ultimatum with the practiced cadence of someone reading from an established script, the words carrying the weight of countless successful surrenders. The message contained no room for negotiation or further scientific discussion, just the cold reality of their military advantage and Earth's supposed helplessness. You have 6 standard hours to reconsider your position. The timing was calculated precisely based on psychological models of primitive civilizations facing overwhelming force. Their experience showed that this window created maximum anxiety, while allowing just enough time for planetary leadership to organize surrender without triggering desperate last stands. The countdown began immediately, with the Zerithian fleet positioning itself for optimal bombardment angles against major population centers. Their tactical displays lit up with pre-selected targets that would demonstrate their destructive capability while minimizing unnecessary damage to infrastructure they intended to exploit. The classic immediate integration into the collective demand followed the established protocol exactly. The transmission included detailed terms of surrender, economic integration frameworks, and governance structures that would replace Earth's existing political systems. They expected panic, rushed emergency meetings, desperate counteroffers, or possibly even civil unrest as different factions struggled to respond to the deadline. Their psychological warfare specialists monitored global communications for signs of the predictable breakdown that preceded organized surrender on other worlds. Standard threat: bombardment of major population centers with precision kinetic weapons that would demonstrate their capability without destroying the planet's economic value. Their targeting computers had already identified 27 cities that would serve as convincing examples of their firepower if Earth failed to comply. The demonstration strikes would be calculated to maximize psychological impact, while preserving the industrial and agricultural infrastructure they intended to control. They'd refined this approach through multiple successful pacifications, each time adjusting their tactics based on previous outcomes. But Earth's response wasn't capitulation or panic. Instead of emergency government meetings or desperate pleas for more time, their sensors detected coordinated movements across the solar system that suggested something entirely different from surrender preparations. The planetary defense network began activating in a carefully orchestrated sequence that showed both capability and restraint. Their communications included no counter threats or emotional appeals, just calm acknowledgments of receipt and a request for clarification on specific technical points in their surrender documentation. They decided to reveal the full breadth of their capabilities without resorting to actual violence. The response was calculated to demonstrate that Earth wasn't vulnerable to standard intimidation tactics, while leaving open the possibility of peaceful resolution. Their approach focused on showing the Zerithians that continued aggression would be futile and costly, rather than attempting to match their threatening tone. The demonstration was designed to be comprehensive enough to convince even the most skeptical military analysts that Earth's defensive capabilities were real and immediately available. At one point, the Zerithians intercepted a transmission that changed everything about their assessment of the situation. Their signals intelligence team had been monitoring countless channels, expecting to find panic, confusion, or desperate attempts at negotiation. Instead, they caught a clean, professional exchange on a secured military frequency that sounded nothing like a civilization facing annihilation. The voice identified itself with two words that would later become famous in tactical analysis circles across the galaxy. "Terror here, Commander Turner from the International Defense Station." His tone was so calm and matter-of-fact that the Zerithian translators initially suspected some kind of audio malfunction or cultural misunderstanding. He sounded like a traffic controller discussing routine orbital adjustments or a scientist reporting weather satellite data, not someone coordinating planetary defense against an alien invasion fleet. There was no tension in his voice, no elevated stress indicators, just the steady cadence of someone doing a job they'd trained for years to perform. He confirmed visual data on their fleet with clinical precision that made their own tactical officers uneasy. His assessment noted ship classifications, formation patterns, energy signatures, and potential vulnerabilities with detached professionalism. He wasn't speculating or estimating. He was reading off confirmed tracking data from multiple sensor platforms as if reviewing a routine exercise. The casual certainty in his voice suggested this wasn't some last-minute, desperate measure, but part of an established defense protocol they'd practiced countless times before. Earth had a secret force multiplier they'd spent 20 years refining, without anyone beyond their atmosphere noticing. The International Defense Station wasn't some massive weapons platform or obvious military installation. It functioned as both the literal and symbolic nerve center of their entire distributed defense network. Its importance wasn't in its physical armament, but in its coordination capacity, its ability to manage thousands of separate systems as a single cohesive unit. The station served as the central processing node for sensor data, threat analysis, and response coordination across the entire solar system. Turner's analysis noted that their ships looked intimidating but flew predictable formations that suggested standardized tactical training rather than adaptive combat experience. His assessment highlighted patterns they'd seen in other spacefaring militaries, conventional approaches to fleet deployment that Earth's unconventional defense system was specifically designed to counter. He pointed out how their weapon placements followed logical but predictable patterns, how their shield distribution showed standard doctrinal thinking, how their sensor coverage left consistent gaps that Earth's distributed network could exploit. Human strength wasn't in individual weapons, platforms, but in the orchestration of dispersed systems that could adapt and respond as a single organism. They'd turned planetary defense into a living, breathing entity that could shift resources, reassign priorities, and counter threats through emergent coordination rather than centralized command. The IDS didn't need to control every weapon. It just needed to ensure the right systems were talking to each other and responding to threats in coordinated fashion. The balance of power could shift, with a few tactical alignments that would make their numerical advantage meaningless. Turner's transmission discussed repositioning asteroid mining lasers to create crossing fields of fire, rerouting communication satellites to enhance targeting resolution, even using weather modification systems to create atmospheric conditions that would degrade certain types of sensor performance. Their defense didn't require building superior weapons. It involved using existing systems in clever combinations that would overwhelm traditional military thinking. The Zerithian tactical team realized they weren't facing a primitive civilization trying to mount a last-minute defense. They were looking at a fully developed planetary security system that had been operating silently for years, waiting for exactly this kind of test. The calm professionalism in that intercepted transmission suggested this wasn't their first simulation of this scenario, just the first time they'd needed to implement it for real. Their entire invasion plan had been built around overwhelming a disorganized response, but they were facing something far more dangerous, a coordinated defense that had been preparing for this moment for decades. Let me explain how humanity pulled off this defense without anyone noticing. They never built a single mega construction project that screamed military expansion or territorial ambition. There were no massive shipyards constructing dreadnoughts, no orbital fortresses with obvious weapon emplacements, no military parades showcasing new technology. Everything they created served peaceful purposes first, with defensive capabilities engineered into the design from the beginning. The approach was fundamentally different from traditional military buildup, because it focused on leveraging existing infrastructure rather than creating separate military systems. Instead, They leveraged every scientific advancement for dual purposes that weren't immediately apparent to outside observers. The particle physics research programs studying antimatter production weren't just theoretical exercises. They developed practical containment systems that could be adapted for warhead manufacturing within hours of activation. The teams working on gravitational wave detection were simultaneously refining early warning systems for spatial anomalies and incoming threats. Even the deep space communication networks designed for scientific exploration could be recalibrated for military coordination and targeting data transmission. Space exploration programs developed gravitational manipulation technology that served both transportation and defensive applications. The same systems that allowed for efficient orbital insertion could create gravitational lensing effects that distorted incoming weapons fire. The mining operations in the asteroid belt used precision laser cutters that could be repurposed as directed energy weapons with minor adjustments to focusing arrays and power distribution. The Martian colonization efforts required advanced life support systems that doubled as radiation shielding against energy-based attacks. Even the planetary transportation grid hid distributed energy weapon capabilities within its infrastructure. The magnetic levitation networks contained precision guidance systems adaptable for missile tracking and interception. The global power distribution system could redirect massive energy flows to defensive emplacements during emergencies. The communication satellites orbiting Earth could simultaneously broadcast entertainment programming and coordinate defensive fire solutions across continents. The entire technological ecosystem was designed with layered functionality that remained invisible during peacetime operations. Most scientists working on these projects thought they were conducting purely peaceful research for civilian applications. The physicists studying antimatter containment believed they were working on clean energy solutions. The engineers developing gravitational manipulation systems thought they were creating more efficient space travel methods. The technicians maintaining the global transportation network assumed they were just keeping people and goods moving efficiently. The military applications emerged naturally from the research without requiring explicit weapons development programs, making the transformation from peaceful civilization to fortified world almost seamless. This stealth approach made Earth a fortress without appearing threatening to outside observers. The Zerithian intelligence analysts were looking for traditional military indicators like troop concentrations, weapons factories, and military communications. They saw civilian research facilities, infrastructure projects, and scientific collaborations, all things that typically indicate a civilization focused on development rather than defense. The distributed nature of the capabilities meant there were no obvious targets to monitor, no conspicuous weapons tests to detect, no massive military budgets that would trigger attention. The galaxy's traditional warfighting logic completely missed this asymmetry because it was looking for the wrong indicators entirely. Military analysts across known space measured strength by fleet size, troop numbers, and visible weapon emplacements. They assessed threat levels based on military spending as percentage of GDP, weapons research publications, and parade demonstrations of new technology. Earth demonstrated that true defensive capability could be woven into the fabric of civilian society, invisible until needed, yet immediately available when required. Their approach required no massive military budgets that would alert observers, no conspicuous weapons development programs that would trigger sanctions, just steady, quiet preparation using resources that already existed for other purposes. The Zerithian assessment teams were looking at the most comprehensively defended planet they'd ever encountered, and they'd almost missed it because they were looking for traditional military patterns rather than integrated defensive systems, not as an attack, but as a controlled public demonstration that allowed the Zerithians to observe and assess their actual situation. Earth's Defense Coordination Center transmitted real-time sensor data and tactical assessments back to the invasion fleet, essentially showing them what their own systems were detecting, but with additional contextual analysis. They provided detailed breakdowns of weapons capabilities, coordination systems, and response protocols that demonstrated their defensive readiness without revealing all their strategic advantages. Within minutes, the asteroid belt's installations repositioned into firing positions that covered every approach vector to Earth. Mining lasers realigned to cover potential bombardment trajectories. Resource processing stations shifted to create overlapping fields of fire, and navigation beacons began emitting targeting interference patterns. The transformation happened with coordinated precision that suggested extensive preparation and regular drills. What had appeared to be civilian infrastructure moments before became clearly recognizable as military assets with specific defensive functions. Orbital platforms coordinated into a protective lattice that provided overlapping coverage across all orbital planes. Communication satellites shifted from civilian bandwidth to military encryption. Weather monitoring stations began tracking weapons trajectories, and scientific outposts activated sensor arrays that painted the Zerithian fleet with multiple targeting systems. The integration between different platforms showed a level of coordination that exceeded anything in the Zerithian military doctrine, with systems communicating across vast distances without detectable lag or confusion. The mismatch became a panoramic display of integrated defense that made their invasion force look suddenly vulnerable despite its numerical advantage. The Zerithian tactical computers began recalculating combat projections based on the new defensive configurations, and the results showed potential casualty rates that made continued aggression seem irrational. Their strategic advantage had evaporated not through direct combat, but through revealed capability that changed the fundamental calculation of risk versus reward. The invasion plan that had seemed certain hours before now appeared dangerously misguided. Look at how Earth handled this moment of maximum tension. They maintained a disciplined approach that must have been frustratingly confusing for the Zerithian command structure. Their defense network activated with coordinated precision, but refrained from any offensive action against the invasion fleet. Every system movement, every power surge, every targeting lock was calculated to demonstrate capability without crossing into actual aggression. The approach showed remarkable restraint coupled with undeniable readiness. They didn't fire a single shot at the Zerithian vessels despite having clear targeting solutions and apparent opportunities to disable multiple ships. Their weapon systems tracked the invasion fleet with unwavering precision, energy readings spiking to combat levels, but no actual discharge occurred beyond test firings into empty space. They demonstrated targeting accuracy by vaporizing test objects with surgical precision at extreme ranges, showing they could hit what they aimed at without needing to prove it on actual targets. The message was clear. They had the capability but chose not to use it. Instead, they showed targeted energy and kinetic weapon capabilities through carefully choreographed demonstrations away from the invasion force. Laser arrays focused on designated asteroids, slicing them apart with clean, efficient energy bursts. Kinetic weapons launched test projectiles that intercepted simulated targets with perfect accuracy. Gravitational manipulation systems created localized distortions that demonstrated their ability to deflect incoming fire or disrupt enemy formations. Each demonstration was accompanied by technical data, transmissions explaining exactly what was being shown and its potential combat applications. They demonstrated how fragile the alien advantage truly was against their integrated defense approach. Their sensor network showed the Zerithian fleet's vulnerabilities in real-time analysis, highlighting weak points in their shield coverage, predictable patterns in their defensive positioning, and limitations in their sensor resolution. Earth systems illustrated how they could exploit these weaknesses through coordinated attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously. The demonstrations made it clear that their numerical advantage meant little against a defense system that could attack from unexpected angles with overwhelming force. Every movement was calculated to deter rather than destroy, to convince rather than conquer. The repositioning of orbital platforms created defensive formations that covered all approach angles without appearing aggressive. The activation of ground-based systems showed additional layers of defense without threatening the orbiting ships. The coordination between different elements demonstrated that attacking one part of the system would trigger responses from multiple other components. The overall effect was to make continued aggression seem both pointless and dangerous. The purpose was to make aggression seem irrational by demonstrating the certain costs of any attack. Their systems showed calculated casualty projections for various attack scenarios, each illustrating the devastating losses the Zerithians would suffer even in successful engagements. They transmitted analysis of how their distributed defense network could continue functioning even after substantial damage, how backup systems would activate automatically, and how retaliatory measures would be both immediate and overwhelming. The message was clear. Victory would be impossible, and even minor success would come at unacceptable cost. General Webb's explanation to Admiral Vexthara was brutally clear in its simplicity and finality. He didn't threaten or boast. He simply laid out the tactical reality as their systems had calculated it. He explained Earth's defensive philosophy without embellishment, emphasizing that their capabilities existed solely for protection rather than expansion. His tone remained professional and matter-of-fact throughout, treating the situation as a technical problem rather than a conflict. The communication was notable for its complete lack of emotion or rhetorical flourish. Earth wasn't expansionist and had no interest in conquering other planets or establishing an interstellar empire. Their entire defense strategy was built around protecting their home system, rather than projecting power outward. They emphasized that their technological development focused on improving quality of life rather than military dominance. The demonstration of force was presented as an unfortunate necessity rather than a display of ambition. Their communications consistently reinforced that they sought peaceful coexistence rather than territorial expansion. Their defense was designed for overwhelming, distributed retaliation that could respond to threats from any direction with coordinated force. The system wasn't built to conquer territory but to make conquest attempts so costly that no rational civilization would attempt them. Their approach focused on making Earth the most defended but least aggressive planet in known space. The combination of demonstrated capability and stated peaceful intentions created a powerful deterrent that didn't rely on threats or aggression. This redefined what it meant to be a major power in galactic terms by separating defensive capability from expansionist ambition. Previous galactic powers had always combined military strength with territorial acquisition, assuming that one necessarily followed the other. Earth demonstrated that a civilization could maintain overwhelming defensive capability without seeking to dominate others. Their approach suggested that true security came from making attack irrational rather than from conquering potential threats. The galaxy's understanding of power dynamics shifted from measuring expansion to assessing defensive integrity. Here's what really unsettled centuries of galactic strategy. The Zerithian command structure had operated on a simple principle for generations. Military capability directly correlated with expansionist ambition. If a civilization could defend itself effectively, it would inevitably seek to conquer others. Their entire tactical doctrine, their intelligence assessment protocols, their diplomatic approaches, all built around this fundamental assumption that power projection and territorial acquisition were inseparable concepts. Earth's demonstration didn't just show unexpected defensive capability. It shattered this core philosophical foundation. Earth proved a civilization could be both deeply prepared and deliberately non-expansionist in ways that defied conventional military analysis. Their technological development showed clear defensive priorities, without corresponding offensive capabilities that would enable conquest. They'd engineered systems specifically designed to protect their home system, without providing any practical means for projecting power beyond it. The distinction was both subtle and revolutionary. They could make themselves virtually unconquerable without being able to conquer others themselves. Their defense philosophy was about deterrence, not conquest, which represented a complete departure from established galactic norms. Every major power they'd encountered built military forces that served both defensive and offensive purposes, with the capability to project power outward being seen as essential for true security. Earth's approach suggested that perfect defense could exist independently from offensive capability, that making your territory impossible to conquer might be more effective than trying to conquer others' territories. This inverted the traditional power equation that had governed interstellar relations for centuries. Asymmetric deterrence meant protecting the home system so comprehensively that no rational aggressor would risk a fight regardless of their own capabilities. The calculation shifted from comparing relative strength to assessing absolute cost. It didn't matter if an attacking force was larger or more advanced. What mattered was whether the defense could guarantee unacceptable losses regardless of the attacker's advantages. Earth's system was designed to make that calculation simple and unambiguous for any potential aggressor. This wasn't about having a single planet-killer weapon that could threaten mutual destruction. Those systems had existed before and typically led to arms races and tension. Earth's approach was fundamentally different because it focused on defense rather than retaliation. Their capability wasn't about threatening others with destruction, but about preventing others from successfully attacking them. The distinction might seem subtle, but it changed the psychological dynamic completely from mutual threat to unilateral security. It was about creating a distributed system that could retaliate from multiple vectors with coordinated precision that overwhelmed traditional offensive tactics. The strength came from integration rather than individual components, from coordination rather than raw power. An attacking force might neutralize one element only to find three others attacking from unexpected directions. The system was designed to adapt and respond rather than simply absorb or counterattack, making it unpredictable and therefore unstoppable through conventional military planning. The Zerithian High Command's reassessment became a strategic pivot that would eventually influence military doctrine across multiple civilizations. Their analysts had to develop entirely new assessment criteria that could identify this type of defensive capability that didn't follow traditional patterns. They created new classification categories for civilizations that could defend themselves effectively without showing expansionist tendencies. The very definition of military power began shifting from offensive capability to defensive integrity. They saw a civilization that could project deterrence without expanding, that could influence galactic politics through defensive strength rather than territorial control. Earth's security created a stability that others could rely on without fearing domination. Their non-expansionist stance made them potential partners rather than threats, while their defensive capability made them valuable allies rather than vulnerable targets. This combination created a new type of diplomatic influence that didn't rely on conquest or coercion. Earth's neutrality became a functional power rather than a weakness because it was backed by undeniable defensive capability. Their refusal to take sides wasn't based on helplessness but on calculated strength. They could remain neutral because nobody could force them to choose sides. This allowed them to serve as mediators, safe zones, and stabilizing influences in regional conflicts without being drawn into the conflicts themselves. Their security made their neutrality credible and valuable, rather than precarious. The galaxy was witnessing a new model of interstellar relations that separated security from domination for the first time in recorded history. Earth demonstrated that a civilization could be completely secure without threatening others, could influence events without controlling territory, could shape galactic politics without building an empire. This challenged centuries of assumptions about how power worked in interstellar space and suggested that security might be achieved through different means than traditional military expansion. So the official after-action report tells the real story better than any dramatic retelling ever could. You can practically see the analysts scratching their heads as they compiled the data, trying to fit what they'd witnessed into their existing classification systems and finding that nothing quite matched. The document reads like someone trying to describe a completely new color using only existing color names. The language strains against the reality it's attempting to capture. Subject species humans Terrasol 3. Classification previously listed as primitive expansion candidate. That single line must have generated more departmental memos and procedural reviews than any intelligence failure in recent history. The initial assessment teams had followed standard protocols, checking all the usual indicators for technological development and military capability. They'd looked for shipyards, weapons factories, military research facilities, all the traditional markers of a civilization's power projection capacity. They completely missed the distributed nature of Earth's defense approach because it didn't resemble anything in their recognition manuals. The recommendation: advanced defensive civilization, avoid engagement. Those 5 words represented a fundamental shift in how galactic powers assessed potential threats and opportunities. Previously, civilizations were categorized based on their expansion potential and offensive capability. Now they had to create an entirely new classification for species that could defend themselves effectively without showing any interest in conquering others. The classification came with updated assessment protocols that emphasized looking for integrated defensive networks rather than traditional military infrastructure. The language matters because it codifies a new standard that would eventually influence diplomatic and military thinking across multiple civilizations. Previously, advanced meant capable of projecting power beyond your home system. Now it included civilizations that could make their home system effectively unconquerable through distributed defensive networks. This changed risk calculations for everyone. From military planners to trade negotiators to colonization, committees' defensive networks with diplomatic clout could redefine interstellar politics by separating security from territorial control. Earth demonstrated that a civilization could influence events and ensure its security without building an empire or controlling other species. Their approach suggested that stability could be achieved through mutual security rather than mutual threat, through demonstrated defensive capability rather than offensive deployment. This offered a different model for interstellar relations that didn't require constant expansion and conflict. No need for imperial expansion to be considered a major power. That concept alone must have kept strategic planners awake for weeks. The entire galactic power structure had been built around the assumption that influence required territory, that security demanded control, that strength meant expansion. Earth's demonstration suggested that a civilization could achieve complete security and significant influence without controlling a single square kilometer beyond its home system. This challenged centuries of political and military doctrine simultaneously, not as an attack, but as a controlled public demonstration that allowed the Zerithians to observe and assess their actual situation. Earth's Defense Coordination Center transmitted real-time sensor data and tactical assessments back to the invasion fleet, essentially showing them what their own systems were detecting, but with additional contextual analysis. They provided detailed breakdowns of weapons capabilities, coordination systems, and response protocols that demonstrated their defensive readiness without revealing all their strategic advantages. Within minutes, the asteroid belt's installations repositioned into firing positions that covered every approach vector to Earth. Mining lasers realigned to cover potential bombardment trajectories. Resource processing stations shifted to create overlapping fields of fire, and navigation beacons began emitting targeting interference patterns. The transformation happened with coordinated precision that suggested extensive preparation and regular drills. What had appeared to be civilian infrastructure moments before became clearly recognizable as military assets with specific defensive functions. Orbital platforms coordinated into a protective lattice that provided overlapping coverage across all orbital planes. Communication satellites shifted from civilian bandwidth to military encryption. Weather monitoring stations began tracking weapons trajectories, and scientific outposts activated sensor arrays that painted the Zerithian fleet with multiple targeting systems. The integration between different platforms showed a level of coordination that exceeded anything in the Zerithian military doctrine, with systems communicating across vast distances without detectable lag or confusion. The mismatch became a panoramic display of integrated defense that made their invasion force look suddenly vulnerable despite its numerical advantage. The Zerithian tactical computers began recalculating combat projections based on the new defensive configurations, and the results showed potential casualty rates that made continued aggression seem irrational. Their strategic advantage had evaporated not through direct combat, but through revealed capability that changed the fundamental calculation of risk versus reward. The invasion plan that had seemed certain hours before now appeared dangerously misguided. Look at how Earth handled this moment of maximum tension. They maintained a disciplined approach that must have been frustratingly confusing for the Zerithian command structure. Their defense network activated with coordinated precision, but refrained from any offensive action against the invasion fleet. Every system movement, every power surge, every targeting lock was calculated to demonstrate capability without crossing into actual aggression. The approach showed remarkable restraint coupled with undeniable readiness. They didn't fire a single shot at the Zerithian vessels despite having clear targeting solutions and apparent opportunities to disable multiple ships. Their weapon systems tracked the invasion fleet with unwavering precision, energy readings spiking to combat levels, but no actual discharge occurred beyond test firings into empty space. They demonstrated targeting accuracy by vaporizing test objects with surgical precision at extreme ranges, showing they could hit what they aimed at without needing to prove it on actual targets. The message was clear. They had the capability but chose not to use it. Instead, they showed targeted energy and kinetic weapon capabilities through carefully choreographed demonstrations away from the invasion force. Laser arrays focused on designated asteroids, slicing them apart with clean, efficient energy bursts. Kinetic weapons launched test projectiles that intercepted simulated targets with perfect accuracy. Gravitational manipulation systems created localized distortions that demonstrated their ability to deflect incoming fire or disrupt enemy formations. Each demonstration was accompanied by technical data, transmissions explaining exactly what was being shown and its potential combat applications. They demonstrated how fragile the alien advantage truly was against their integrated defense approach. Their sensor network showed the Zerithian fleet's vulnerabilities in real-time analysis, highlighting weak points in their shield coverage, predictable patterns in their defensive positioning, and limitations in their sensor resolution. Earth systems illustrated how they could exploit these weaknesses through coordinated attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously. The demonstrations made it clear that their numerical advantage meant little against a defense system that could attack from unexpected angles with overwhelming force. Every movement was calculated to deter rather than destroy, to convince rather than conquer. The repositioning of orbital platforms created defensive formations that covered all approach angles without appearing aggressive. The activation of ground-based systems showed additional layers of defense without threatening the orbiting ships. The coordination between different elements demonstrated that attacking one part of the system would trigger responses from multiple other components. The overall effect was to make continued aggression seem both pointless and dangerous. The purpose was to make aggression seem irrational by demonstrating the certain costs of any attack. Their systems showed calculated casualty projections for various attack scenarios, each illustrating the devastating losses the Zerithians would suffer even in successful engagements. They transmitted analysis of how their distributed defense network could continue functioning even after substantial damage, how backup systems would activate automatically, and how retaliatory measures would be both immediate and overwhelming. The message was clear. Victory would be impossible, and even minor success would come at unacceptable cost. General Webb's explanation to Admiral Vexthara was brutally clear in its simplicity and finality. He didn't threaten or boast. He simply laid out the tactical reality as their systems had calculated it. He explained Earth's defensive philosophy without embellishment, emphasizing that their capabilities existed solely for protection rather than expansion. His tone remained professional and matter-of-fact throughout, treating the situation as a technical problem rather than a conflict. The communication was notable for its complete lack of emotion or rhetorical flourish. Earth wasn't expansionist and had no interest in conquering other planets or establishing an interstellar empire. Their entire defense strategy was built around protecting their home system rather than projecting power outward. They emphasized that their technological development focused on improving quality of life rather than military dominance. The demonstration of force was presented as an unfortunate necessity rather than a display of ambition. Their communications consistently reinforced that they sought peaceful coexistence rather than territorial expansion. Their defense was designed for overwhelming, distributed retaliation that could respond to threats from any direction with coordinated force. The system wasn't built to conquer territory but to make conquest attempts so costly that no rational civilization would attempt them. Their approach focused on making Earth the most defended but least aggressive planet in known space. The combination of demonstrated capability and stated peaceful intentions created a powerful deterrent that didn't rely on threats or aggression. This redefined what it meant to be a major power in galactic terms by separating defensive capability from expansionist ambition. Previous galactic powers had always combined military strength with territorial acquisition, assuming that one necessarily followed the other. Earth demonstrated that a civilization could maintain overwhelming defensive capability without seeking to dominate others. Their approach suggested that true security came from making attack irrational rather than from conquering potential threats. The galaxy's understanding of power dynamics shifted from measuring expansion to assessing defensive integrity. Earth offered safe passage and formal diplomatic engagement immediately after demonstrating their defensive capabilities. They didn't demand concessions or territory or tribute. They simply invited normalized relations based on mutual respect and non-aggression. Their approach emphasized coexistence rather than domination, cooperation rather than control. They treated the Zerithians not as defeated enemies, but as potential partners who had made a strategic miscalculation. Not conquest, but coexistence as the new model that other civilizations could emulate or adapt to their own circumstances. Earth's approach demonstrated that security didn't have to come at the expense of others' security, that a civilization could be completely safe without making others feel threatened. This created possibilities for stable diplomatic relationships that didn't depend on constant military readiness or suspicion. The galaxy began to question centuries of expansionist strategy that had consumed resources and lives across multiple civilizations. Military analysts started re-examining historical conflicts, wondering if different approaches might have yielded better outcomes with lower costs. Diplomatic corps began developing new engagement protocols that accounted for this different model of power and influence. The entire framework for assessing civilizations and planning interactions underwent significant revision. Maybe you didn't need to conquer everyone to be secure. That realization must have been particularly unsettling. For empires built on constant expansion, Earth's demonstration suggested that defensive capability could provide security more effectively than offensive capability because it didn't trigger the resistance and retaliation that conquest inevitably produced. Their approach showed that making your territory impossible to conquer might be more sustainable than trying to conquer other territories. This simple but revolutionary idea began spreading through military academies and strategic planning departments across known space. In the months that followed, Earth's emergence reshaped everything about how regional powers interacted. The diplomatic landscape that had been dominated by expansionist empires and fragile alliances suddenly had a new player who operated by completely different rules. Earth didn't seek territory or resources from other civilizations. They offered stability and security through a framework that became known as the Soul Accords. The name emerged from the founding principle that every civilization had a right to exist, without fear of conquest or domination. The Soul Accords became a durable framework for regional stability precisely because they weren't built on military conquest or economic coercion. Previous peace agreements typically involved winners imposing terms on losers, or powerful nations extracting concessions from weaker ones. Earth's approach started from the position that all participants were equals entering voluntary arrangements for mutual benefit. The Accords provided mechanisms for dispute resolution, mutual defense coordination, and economic cooperation without requiring surrender of sovereignty or territory. They blended defense, diplomacy, and mutual economic interest in ways that previous agreements had never attempted. The defense provisions focused on collective security rather than collective aggression, with clear limits on when and how military force could be applied. The diplomatic frameworks established mediation protocols and conflict prevention measures that addressed tensions before they escalated into violence. The economic components created trade relationships that benefited all participants without creating dependency or exploitation patterns. Secretary General Martinez became the central mediator for dozens of civilizations almost by accident rather than design. Earth's unique position as a powerful but non-expansionist civilization made them acceptable to both sides in various disputes. Their demonstrated defensive capabilities gave them credibility when discussing security arrangements, while their refusal to seek territory made them trustworthy mediators. Martinez developed a reputation for practical solutions that addressed actual problems rather than political posturing. 43 species signed preliminary agreements within the first year, representing everything from recently spacefaring civilizations to established regional powers. The diversity of participants demonstrated the broad appeal of Earth's approach to interstellar relations. Previously isolated civilizations saw an opportunity to gain security without surrendering autonomy. Larger powers recognized the stability benefits of having clear rules of engagement and conflict resolution mechanisms. 15 major powers committed to mutual defense provisions that represented a significant shift in regional security thinking. These weren't traditional military alliances aimed at countering specific threats, but broader agreements about how defense would be coordinated across multiple civilizations. The provisions emphasized rapid response to aggression against any signatory, but with clear rules of engagement that prevented escalation or unauthorized actions. The focus remained on deterrence and de-escalation, rather than offensive operations. Earth hosted rapid response mediation teams and pre-positioned stations at key locations throughout the region. These weren't military bases but diplomatic facilities staffed by conflict resolution specialists from multiple civilizations. The teams could deploy quickly to emerging crises, bringing both mediation expertise and the credibility of Earth's backing. The stations served as neutral meeting places where disputing parties could negotiate without either side having home advantage. They built a network capable of defusing disputes before they erupted into war through early intervention and trusted mediation. The system relied on extensive information sharing about potential conflicts, early warning mechanisms for emerging tensions, and established protocols for bringing parties to negotiation. Previous attempts at conflict prevention had failed because they lacked either the credibility or the capability to enforce agreements. Earth provided both. Through their defensive reputation and mediation, resources the galaxy's major powers began modeling their diplomacy around Earth's approach because it produced better outcomes with lower costs. Traditional expansionist strategies required constant military investment, created persistent resistance from conquered populations, and eventually led to overextension and collapse. Earth's model provided security through cooperation rather than conquest, stability through inclusion rather than domination. The comparative success became impossible to ignore even for the most traditional imperial powers. Neutral but toothsome deterrence became the new standard for civilizations that wanted security without constant conflict. The approach combined demonstrated defensive capability with clear, peaceful intentions, making aggression irrational while making cooperation attractive. Civilizations could focus on development rather than constant military preparation, on cooperation rather than suspicion. The shift represented the most significant change in interstellar relations since the development of faster-than-light travel. Let me end with Dr. Richard's reflection on what they'd accomplished, because sometimes the person who starts the story understands best how it finished. We caught up years later at some diplomatic function, him still wearing that same slightly rumpled look of someone who'd rather be in a lab than a reception hall. He had that way of cutting through the noise to the simple truth underneath. All the strategic analysis and political positioning. Conquering would have produced a single heavily defended world, surrounded by resentful neighbors waiting for any sign of weakness. We've seen that story play out across a dozen empires. You build walls higher, patrol borders tighter, until you're spending so much resources on defense that you can't actually enjoy the security you've created. The historical records are full of civilizations that won every battle but eventually lost because they created more enemies than they could manage, but it would have alienated neighbors and triggered punitive responses that would have required even more military spending and tighter control. You create a cycle where each defensive measure prompts new threats, each expansion creates new vulnerabilities, until the entire structure becomes unsustainable. The mathematics of empire never really add up in the long term because the costs constantly escalate while the benefits steadily diminish. Instead, humans built a network that protected their own interests while providing stability for everyone involved. They created systems that deterred aggression without requiring constant military action, that mediated disputes without taking sides, that provided security without demanding submission. The approach was fundamentally different because it sought to reduce threats rather than eliminate enemies, to create stability rather than assert control. Through a credible show of defensive capability rather than aggressive expansion, they changed the entire calculation for potential adversaries. The demonstration wasn't about threatening others, but about making threats against them irrational. The distinction might seem subtle, but it changes the psychological dynamic completely from mutual suspicion to unilateral stability. Other civilizations didn't have to trust Earth's intentions. They just had to understand the practical reality of the situation. The galaxy's consensus gradually recognized this new model as both effective and sustainable. You started seeing military academies teaching Earth's defensive approach alongside traditional offensive doctrines. Strategic analysts began including defensive integrity as a separate category in threat assessment protocols. Even Admiral Vexthara eventually acknowledged that their initial miscalculation had revealed a fundamentally different approach to security that deserved serious consideration. A defensively centered but diplomatically engaged power could achieve security without creating the resentment and resistance that inevitably followed conquest. Earth demonstrated that influence could come from being a reliable partner rather than a dominant power, from providing stability rather than imposing control. Their approach created relationships built on mutual interest rather than forced compliance, which proved both more durable and less expensive to maintain. Empires require constant military action to maintain control over conquered territories and suppressed populations. The historical records show the pattern repeating across multiple civilizations. Initial conquest seems efficient until you factor in the ongoing costs of occupation, resistance suppression, and administrative control. The mathematics of domination rarely work in the long term because subjugated populations never stop looking for opportunities to regain their freedom. They tend to collapse spectacularly when someone figures out the right kind of resistance, or when internal pressures become unsustainable. We've watched empires that seemed permanent suddenly fragment when their military advantage erodes, or when the costs of control exceed the benefits of domination. The very structures that make empires powerful also make them vulnerable to coordinated resistance and internal decay. Earth and its allies formed a regional security network spanning dozens of systems without conquering a single world or suppressing any populations. The participating civilizations joined because they saw benefits rather than fearing consequences, because they gained security without losing autonomy. The network grew through demonstration of effectiveness rather than application of force, through proven reliability rather than threatened punishment. The approach created stability that didn't require constant reinforcement because it was built on consent rather than coercion. So what did the galaxy learn about power from humanity? The Zerithian incident forced a fundamental reassessment of what strength actually looks like across interstellar distances. Military analysts who'd spent careers measuring fleet sizes and weapon yields suddenly had to account for civilizations that could defend themselves without building traditional military structures. The standard metrics of power, ship counts, troop numbers, orbital fortifications, became incomplete pictures that missed the most important variable: how effectively a civilization could leverage its entire technological base for defense. True strength isn't always overt or aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet confidence of systems that don't need to prove themselves until necessary. Earth demonstrated that the most effective defense might be one that remains invisible during peacetime, integrated so completely into civilian infrastructure that it doesn't register on standard threat assessment scans. Their approach showed that constantly displaying military capability can actually weaken security by inviting arms races and preemptive strikes, while keeping capabilities hidden but ready creates uncertainty that deters aggression. Seemingly peaceful advancements can serve dual purposes when needed, transforming ordinary infrastructure into defensive networks with minimal adjustments. The same gravitational research that enables efficient space travel can create defensive distortions against incoming weapons. The communication satellites that broadcast entertainment can coordinate targeting data across continents. The energy grid that powers cities can redirect massive power flows to defensive emplacements. The integration is so complete that the transformation from peace to defense readiness happens almost seamlessly. Ingenuity often beats brute force in the long run because it creates solutions that are both more effective and more sustainable. Traditional military expansion consumes enormous resources while creating persistent resistance and eventual overextension. Earth's approach required minimal additional expenditure because it leveraged existing systems and research, creating security through clever application rather than massive investment. The efficiency meant they could maintain their defensive advantage indefinitely without economic strain or domestic opposition. Defense strategy that leverages existing infrastructure can be more effective than traditional military buildup because it doesn't trigger the arms races and preemptive strikes that visible weapons development inevitably produces. The Zerithians never saw Earth's capabilities coming because they were looking for shipyards and weapons factories, not research laboratories and transportation networks. Their assessment protocols were designed to detect traditional military preparation, completely missing the distributed nature of Earth's defense approach. It transforms perceptions of what constitutes military power from counting visible weapons to assessing integrated capability. The galaxy had to develop new assessment criteria that could identify defensive networks woven into civilian infrastructure, coordinated response systems hidden within scientific collaborations, and emergency protocols that could activate capabilities that remained dormant during peacetime. Military academies began teaching courses on asymmetric defense strategies that focused on leveraging existing systems rather than building separate military infrastructure. From expecting familiar invasion narratives to recognizing hidden defenses that don't follow traditional patterns, the Zerithians arrived expecting panic, surrender negotiations, and eventual submission. The same script that had worked across 17 previous civilizations. They encountered instead a coordinated defense that operated on completely different principles, with different objectives and different measures of success. The mismatch between expectation and reality created confusion that undermined their tactical advantage before any shots were fired. Then humanity faced their next test in the outer regions, where established patrol routes were experiencing coordinated disruptions that didn't match any known threat patterns. The incident started as minor navigation hazards, unexplained sensor ghosts, temporary communication blackouts, occasional cargo losses that could be explained by system malfunctions. But the pattern quickly escalated into something more deliberate and threatening, with entire shipping lanes becoming unpredictable and dangerous for commercial traffic. The disturbance pattern suggested a civilization operating with capabilities that defied conventional detection. Methods of previously unknown aggressive power began emerging from analysis of the disturbance patterns, though their exact nature and origin remained unclear for weeks. They operated with phasing technology that allowed them to shift between normal space and what appeared to be alternative dimensional states, making tracking and engagement nearly impossible with traditional military systems. Their ships could appear suddenly, strike with precision, then vanish before conventional weapons could achieve target lock. The technology represented a fundamental challenge to existing defensive doctrines that assumed combat would occur within normal spacetime parameters. Their dimensional manipulation capabilities allowed them to attack from angles and positions that conventional sensors couldn't monitor or predict. They could phase through solid matter, bypassing defensive shields and armor that were designed to stop physical projectiles or energy weapons. Their attacks seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, creating confusion and panic among shipping crews and military patrols alike. The technology wasn't just an advancement, it represented a completely different approach to space combat that rendered most existing defensive systems obsolete. Earth's response was a hybrid of countermeasures and asymmetric warfare that built on their previous experience with unconventional threats. They didn't try to match the phasing technology directly, but developed systems that could operate across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Their approach focused on creating area denial effects rather than precise targeting, making entire regions of space hazardous for the phasing ships, regardless of their dimensional state. The solution involved manipulating fundamental physical constants in localized areas to create conditions that were equally dangerous across all detectable dimensional planes. They learned from the Zerithian miscalculation but scaled their response to a multinational coalition that included multiple civilizations affected by the disruptions. Rather than handling the threat unilaterally, Earth organized a coordinated response that leveraged different species' technological specialties and regional knowledge. The coalition approach distributed the resource burden, while ensuring that any solutions developed would be usable by all member civilizations. This prevented the kind of technological surprise that had caught the Zerithians unprepared while building broader regional cooperation. 47 vessels from 12 civilizations formed a joint task force that combined specialized capabilities from each participating species. The fleet included sensor platforms capable of detecting dimensional fluctuations, interference generators that could disrupt phasing technology, and rapid response units that could engage targets across multiple dimensional states. Each civilization contributed systems based on their particular technological expertise, creating a combined capability that no single species could have mounted independently. The coordination required extensive information sharing and joint training exercises that built trust through practical cooperation. When opponents could phase out of normal spacetime, the answer was to attack the very fabric of spacetime itself across all detectable dimensional states. Earth's scientists developed resonance weapons that affected the underlying structure of reality, rather than targeting ships directly. These systems created localized disturbances that made phasing unpredictable and dangerous, regardless of which dimensional plane a ship occupied. The approach transformed the battlefield, from a contest of targeting and evasion to a conflict over control of the fundamental physical environment, a startling pivot from conventional tactics to multidimensional defense required. Completely rethinking engagement protocols and weapons development. Traditional military thinking focused on hitting targets with greater precision and force, but this threat required making entire regions of space inherently dangerous for the attackers. The coalition developed area denial systems that manipulated gravitational constants, quantum fluctuations, and dimensional boundaries to create defensive zones that couldn't be phased through safely. This represented a fundamental shift from ship-to-ship combat to environmental warfare. The diplomatic leadership then negotiated a path to stability that offered the new civilization options for peaceful integration into the regional community. Rather than seeking to destroy or drive away the threat, Earth's mediators attempted to understand their motivations and address their concerns through diplomatic channels. They established communication protocols that could function across dimensional boundaries and arranged neutral meeting locations where representatives could negotiate without technological advantages or disadvantages influencing the discussions. Join the accords, relocate expansion efforts, or face consequences became the clear options presented through carefully calibrated demonstrations of the coalition's capabilities. The choice was structured to provide a peaceful path while making continued aggression clearly untenable. The accords offered technology sharing and economic integration. Relocation provided alternative expansion territories that didn't conflict with existing civilizations, and the consequences involved demonstrated capabilities that made continued attacks increasingly costly and ineffective. The approach combined diplomatic outreach with undeniable demonstration of defensive capability. 2 years after the Zerithian incident, the model had matured into something nobody could have predicted during those initial tense hours of orbital standoff. Earth's diplomatic and defensive network evolved from emergency response system into permanent infrastructure that served as both shield and platform for regional stability. The transformation happened gradually through countless small adjustments and refinements, rather than dramatic policy shifts, with each crisis providing new data points for improving their approach. What began as planetary defense became interstellar influence exercised through channels that traditional powers were still learning to navigate. The first annual Interstellar Diplomacy Conference aboard Diplomatic Station 2 represented the formalization of this new approach to galactic relations. The station itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic engineering. Neutral territory owned collectively by multiple civilizations, positioned strategically between several major powers, equipped with communication systems that could handle simultaneous translation across hundreds of languages. The design emphasized transparency and accessibility, with meeting spaces arranged to prevent any participant from having positional advantage over others. The architecture alone signaled a different philosophy of interaction than the imposing government complexes most civilizations used for diplomatic proceedings. High-level representatives from dozens of civilizations spent weeks debating trade standards, navigation protocols, and resource allocation frameworks that would affect trillions of beings across multiple star systems. The discussions covered everything from standardized measurement systems for interstellar commerce to conflict resolution mechanisms for border disputes. What made these negotiations different from previous diplomatic efforts was the underlying assumption that agreements should benefit all participants rather than advantage powerful civilizations over weaker ones. The focus shifted from extracting concessions to finding mutually beneficial arrangements. Conflict, prevention protocols, and long-term governance frameworks emerged as the conference's most significant achievements, replacing the ad hoc responses that had characterized previous interstellar relations. The systems established clear escalation pathways, mediation options, and intervention protocols that could be activated before disputes turned violent. They created standing committees for monitoring potential flashpoints, early warning systems for emerging tensions, and rapid response teams that could deploy mediators to crisis situations within hours. The framework represented the most comprehensive attempt at peaceful conflict resolution in recorded galactic history. Earth earned a reputation for turning military confrontations into diplomatic opportunities through consistent demonstration that negotiation produced better outcomes than violence. Their representatives developed an approach that combined firm defensive readiness with flexible diplomatic engagement, creating situations where continued aggression seemed irrational, while negotiation offered clear benefits. They treated every conflict as a potential opportunity to expand the framework of peaceful cooperation, rather than simply ending hostilities. This perspective shift influenced how other civilizations approached disputes, making diplomatic solutions increasingly the first option, rather than last resort. "We've turned diplomacy into a form of warfare," became the quip that captured their approach to interstellar relations. The phrase reflected the strategic precision they applied to diplomatic efforts, the careful calculation of incentives and disincentives, the coordinated use of multiple tools to achieve objectives without resorting to violence. Their diplomatic teams operated with the same discipline and coordination as military units, but their weapons were trade agreements, mediation offers, and mutual defense partnerships rather than ships and weapons. The approach treated diplomatic engagement as active strategy, rather than passive discussion. They'd created a strategic edge through peaceful power, rather than conquest, by demonstrating that cooperation could provide security more effectively than domination. Their influence grew through voluntary partnerships rather than forced subjugation, through demonstrated reliability rather than threatened punishment. Other civilizations sought relationships with Earth because they offered benefits without exploitation, security without surrender of autonomy. This created a network of influence that was both more durable and less expensive to maintain than traditional empires built on military control. The galaxy's balance was shifting without a single shot fired in anger because the costs and benefits of different approaches became increasingly clear through practical demonstration. Civilizations that attempted traditional expansion found themselves facing coordinated resistance and diplomatic isolation, while those that embraced cooperation gained access to new technologies, markets, and security arrangements. The economic advantages of peaceful trade became increasingly apparent as Earth's network facilitated exchanges that benefited all participants without creating dependencies. Empires were expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain, requiring constant military deployment, occupation forces, and suppression of resistance. Earth found a cheaper, more sustainable path that focused on making their home territory secure, while building partnerships that provided stability without conquest. Their approach required investment in diplomacy and defense rather than occupation and control, creating a model that other civilizations could adopt without threatening their neighbors. The comparative efficiency became impossible to ignore, even for traditionally expansionist powers facing budgetary constraints and domestic opposition to endless military campaigns. The epilogue spotlight shows Earth's first faster-than-light research vessel taking shape in the orbital yards, the final product looking nothing like the warships that traditionally defined interstellar power. This thing was purely practical in its design. Clean lines without aggressive angles, sensor arrays optimized for deep space scanning rather than target acquisition, hull configurations that prioritized scientific functionality over combat performance. It reflected years of collaborative design work that balanced exploration needs with necessary defensive considerations, creating something uniquely suited to Earth's particular approach to interstellar relations. A joint project with 17 partner civilizations meant the vessel incorporated technologies and design philosophies from across known space. The propulsion system used principles developed by 3 different species. The navigation computers integrated algorithms from 5 separate technological traditions, and the life support systems blended environmental approaches that worked across multiple biologies. The construction process itself became a diplomatic exercise, with different civilizations contributing specialized components, while learning to work within shared technical standards and safety protocols. The project timeline included as much time for coordination and integration as for actual construction, designed for exploration and defense alike without compromising either function. The scientific capabilities included deep space sensors that could map gravitational anomalies across light years, sample collection systems that could operate in extreme environments, and laboratories capable of analyzing unknown materials with multiple diagnostic approaches. The defensive systems focused on protection rather than aggression, enhanced shielding that could withstand radiation levels found near stellar phenomena, emergency jump capabilities for rapid extraction from dangerous situations, and communication systems with multiple redundancy levels for maintaining contact in hostile environments. This wasn't a warship pretending to be peaceful through cosmetic adjustments or hidden weapon systems. The design team rejected any features that could be interpreted as offensive capability, focusing instead on comprehensive defensive measures that protected the ship and its crew without threatening others. The distinction was both practical and philosophical. They wanted a vessel that could operate safely in unknown regions without appearing threatening to any civilizations it might encounter. The approach required developing new, defensive technologies that provided security without offensive potential. It was genuinely both exploration, capability with defensive measures integrated at fundamental levels rather than added as afterthoughts. The hull composition provided radiation protection for scientific instruments, while offering resistance to potential weapons fire. The power distribution systems could prioritize either research equipment or defensive screens depending on situational requirements. The sensor arrays served both scientific scanning and threat detection functions, without requiring separate systems. This integration made the vessel more capable in both roles. Rather than creating compromises between them, signaled that the galaxy's balance could be shifted by cooperation rather than conquest through practical demonstration of what collaborative development could achieve. The project showed that multiple civilizations could work together on complex technological challenges, without any single species dominating the process or controlling the outcome. The resulting vessel represented capabilities that no individual civilization could have developed independently, proving that cooperation could produce advantages that exceeded what could be achieved through competition or conflict. Humanity hadn't conquered anyone to become a major power involved in such significant development projects. Their participation came through demonstrated reliability and technical competence rather than military strength or territorial control. They earned their place at the design table through previous cooperative efforts that showed they could deliver on commitments and work effectively with diverse teams. Their influence grew from respected capability rather than feared power. They'd reframed power itself through defensive capability and diplomacy that made them valuable partners rather than threatening competitors. Other civilizations sought their participation in projects because they brought unique perspectives and reliable performance without attempting to control outcomes or claim exclusive rights to developed technologies. Their approach created trust that facilitated cooperation across species that might otherwise have been suspicious of each other's motives. The vessel represented a new model for interstellar civilization that combined exploration, cooperation, and security without traditional imperial structures. It showed that a civilization could engage with unknown regions and new species without requiring military dominance or territorial claims. The design philosophy emphasized learning and understanding rather than control and exploitation, reflecting Earth's broader approach to interstellar relations. One that could deter potential threats through demonstrated capability, mediate conflicts through respected neutrality, and cooperate across species boundaries through proven reliability. The vessel's very existence demonstrated that security didn't require aggression, that influence didn't demand control, and that exploration didn't necessitate conquest. It sailed as proof that different approaches to interstellar relations were not just possible, but practical and effective. Humanity never needed a warfleet, just the will to survive creatively using the resources they already possessed. Their approach demonstrated that security could be achieved through intelligent application of existing capabilities rather than acquisition of new military systems. They showed that a civilization could defend itself effectively without aspiring to conquer others, without building massive military structures, without following the traditional path to interstellar influence. They proved that preparation and cleverness could deter superior force by making aggression seem irrational rather than merely difficult. Earth's defense didn't rely on matching the Zerithian fleet ship for ship or weapon for weapon. It focused on creating conditions where any attack would incur costs that exceeded any possible benefits. Their approach changed the calculation from relative strength to absolute cost, making continued aggression seem pointless regardless of numerical advantages. The most powerful defense might be the one nobody sees coming until it's too late to reconsider the attack. Earth's capabilities remained invisible until activation, giving potential adversaries no warning and no opportunity to develop countermeasures. The sudden revelation of integrated defensive systems created psychological impact that mere military parity could never achieve, making reconsideration the only rational choice. The approach demonstrated that sometimes the best defense is one that remains completely hidden until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary. Earth redefined galactic power without conquering a single world or firing a shot in anger. Their strength emerged from integrated systems that turned everyday infrastructure into comprehensive defense, proving that visibility isn't necessary for effectiveness. True strength often conceals itself within ordinary operations, hidden until the moment it's genuinely needed. Consider your own surroundings. What seemingly mundane systems around you might conceal extraordinary potential if viewed through a different lens? The most formidable capabilities frequently masquerade as everyday functions, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their full purpose. You know, when the Zerithian fleet first arrived, they thought Earth was primitive. They expected surrender, fear, panic. But what they got was Dr. Richards from NASA asking about their propulsion systems like it was a tech conference. That moment flipped their entire invasion playbook on its head. You know how every alien invasion story starts with the same tired script? The Zerithians had this playbook they'd practically memorized from dozens of successful campaigns. Their approach followed a clear three-step formula: drop into orbit looking intimidating, trigger mass panic across the planet, then collect the surrender documents from whatever passed for leadership. It worked on civilizations with far more advanced technology than Earth supposedly had. Their intelligence briefing at Sol 3 classified humanity as primitive, but suitable for standard pacification protocols. The assessment noted limited spaceflight capability, fossil fuel dependence, and multiple competing political factions, textbook indicators for easy conquest. They expected to find a quiet little planet that would crumble at the sight of their battle formations. The tactical projections showed complete planetary submission within 6 standard hours of arrival. But Earth wasn't reading from their script. Instead of the usual radio silence or panicked distress calls, the Zerithian listening posts detected something completely unexpected. Nearly 14,000 distinct signals were broadcasting simultaneously across every conceivable frequency. The planet was lit up like some kind of global festival, rather than a civilization facing imminent subjugation. Their communications specialists actually had to recalibrate their equipment because the signal density exceeded their maximum processing parameters. This wasn't the radio silence of terror or the chaotic screaming they documented on other worlds. They were picking up organized traffic control chatter, satellite coordination signals, scientific data streams, and what sounded like entertainment broadcasts continuing without interruption. The initial assessment prepared by their intelligence division began crumbling within minutes of orbital insertion. Their tactical officers kept waiting for the panic to set in, for the civilization to realize its predicament, but the transmissions just kept coming. The comfortable assumptions they'd built their entire strategy around were facing immediate contradiction. This wasn't developing into another routine pacification operation, where they'd simply wait for the locals to understand their inferior position. Their surveillance showed transportation networks operating normally, power grids maintaining stability, and no evidence of the civil unrest that typically preceded organized surrender. The planetary defense systems they'd expected to either be non-existent or easily overwhelmed were presenting a completely different picture upon closer examination. What they'd initially classified as primitive orbital infrastructure began revealing unexpected complexities upon detailed scanning. The sheer density of active satellites and orbital platforms suggested a spacefaring capacity far beyond what their initial briefings indicated. Standard protocol called for overwhelming visible force to trigger psychological collapse, but the psychological impact seemed to be flowing in the opposite direction. The invasion fleet found itself reassessing basic premises, while the target civilization continued, broadcasting cooking shows and weather reports. Their tactical computers started flagging anomalies in the orbital patterns, detecting coordinated movements that didn't match any known civilian or scientific profiles. The comfortable certainty of their playbook was evaporating faster than they could update their situational assessment. This was supposed to be a show of force followed by negotiated surrender. But the negotiations were already taking a form nobody had anticipated. Look, I've seen first contact scenarios where species beg for mercy or try to hide. You get the panicked transmissions, the desperate pleas for negotiation, sometimes even the outright denial that anything unusual is happening. The Zerithian officers had briefing packages filled with response patterns from 17 previous conquests, each with detailed psychological profiles of how primitive civilizations react to overwhelming force. Their communication specialists had prepared translation matrices for every conceivable form of surrender protocol. Dr. Richards from NASA greeted them with the enthusiasm of a kid at a science fair. The initial transmission came through clean and clear on their primary diplomatic frequency, but the content was nothing like their prepared scenarios. There was no formal declaration, no attempt at establishing protocol, just this genuine burst of scientific curiosity that completely bypassed their entire first contact playbook. The voice sounded like someone who'd just discovered the most interesting puzzle in the universe. Holy, are you guys actually aliens? This is fantastic. The Zerithian communications officer actually had to check his equipment to make sure he wasn't receiving some kind of planetary entertainment broadcast by mistake. Their linguistic algorithms kept flagging the transmission as potentially sarcastic or deceptive because the emotional markers indicated genuine excitement rather than fear. The tactical officers were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the real negotiations to begin, but the human side just kept asking increasingly technical questions. They'd prepared for fear, not genuine scientific curiosity. Their psychological warfare specialists had charts predicting how long it would take for the planetary population to reach various stages of despair. None of their models accounted for a civilization that would respond to an alien armada by asking about warp mechanics and energy conversion systems. The human communications team immediately started inquiring about faster-than-light travel principles, material science behind their hull construction, even their waste heat management systems. It was like they'd completely missed the part where they were supposed to be intimidated. This wasn't a surrender negotiation. It was a technical dialogue. The Zerithian flagship's communications center found themselves patching through their engineering staff to answer questions about plasma containment fields and gravitational lensing. Their tactical officers kept trying to steer the conversation toward terms of submission, but the human scientists kept circling back to propulsion theory and energy signatures. The invasion fleet found themselves discussing physics instead of discussing terms of surrender, with their own engineers getting increasingly engaged in the technical exchange despite the circumstances. Humanity's confidence completely derailed the standard intimidation play. The Zerithian admiral actually had to call a pause in communications to reassess their approach because their entire psychological advantage was evaporating with each exchanged technical specification. Instead of facing a panicked civilization begging for mercy, they were dealing with what sounded like the most enthusiastic peer review committee in the galaxy. Their tactical displays still showed overwhelming force advantage, but the psychological battlefield had completely shifted beneath them. That first conversation revealed a planetary temperament the galaxy had never encountered. The humans weren't arrogant or dismissive of the threat. They acknowledged the firepower advantage, quite frankly, but they approached the situation like engineers examining an interesting new system rather than victims facing annihilation. Their questions were precise, informed, and showed a grasp of physical principles that their intelligence reports had claimed was centuries beyond their capabilities. The communication transcripts read more like a university symposium than a surrender negotiation, with the humans even offering some speculative theories about Zerithian technology that turned out to be remarkably accurate. Let me tell you about the real shock that awaited the Zerithians when they started their detailed orbital scans. Their sensor operators expected to find maybe a few dozen military satellites and some civilian communications arrays, the standard profile for a species at Earth's supposed technological level. Instead, their systems registered thousands of active orbital objects, each emitting complex energy signatures that didn't match any known civilian equipment profiles. The initial sensor sweep required 3 separate calibration passes because the computer systems assumed they were experiencing instrumentation errors. Some objects were clearly weapons platforms, with focused energy emitters and kinetic launch systems, but many appeared to be ordinary civilian infrastructure at first glance. Weather satellites that also functioned as targeting relays, communication arrays that could redirect planetary defense coordination signals, even what looked like scientific research stations that housed gravimetric distortion projectors. Earth hadn't built a separate military space infrastructure. They'd engineered dual purposes into everything they put into orbit over decades of development. Earth had spent the last 40 years quietly repurposing peacetime industries into tools of planetary defense, without anyone noticing the transformation. That antimatter production facility in Switzerland wasn't just for physics research. It was manufacturing containment systems that could be adapted for warhead cores within hours. The magnetic levitation transportation networks across Asia and Europe contained precision guidance systems that could be repurposed for missile tracking. Even the global internet infrastructure served as a distributed computing network for threat analysis and weapons targeting. Their communication satellites, power grid management systems, transportation networks. Every major technological system served both its intended civilian function and a secondary defensive purpose. The scientists working on gravitational wave detection were actually refining early warning systems for spatial anomalies. The teams developing quantum computing were creating unbreakable encryption for military communications. The entire scientific community had been conducting military research and development without most researchers even realizing they were contributing to planetary defense. This wasn't a traditional military buildup that screamed conquest or expansion. There were no massive shipyards constructing dreadnoughts, no orbital fortresses bristling with obvious weapons, no parade grounds filled with marching soldiers. Instead, Earth had created a defense network that looked like normal civilian infrastructure until someone activated the hidden capabilities. The transformation could happen almost instantly, turning a planet that appeared technologically primitive into a fortified system within hours. It was a fortress built from everyday technology that nobody noticed until it was too late. The Zerithian intelligence analysts were looking for traditional military indicators, troop concentrations, weapons factories, military communications. They completely missed the distributed nature of Earth's defense approach because it didn't match any known pattern of military preparation. The civilian research grants, infrastructure projects, and scientific collaborations that formed the backbone of their defense capability were so ordinary-looking that they never triggered any alarms in the standard threat assessment protocols. The galaxy's definition of military power was about to get completely rewritten. For centuries, interstellar powers had measured strength by fleet size, troop numbers, and visible weapon emplacements. Earth demonstrated that true defensive capability could be woven into the fabric of civilian society, invisible until needed, yet immediately available when required. Their approach required no massive military budgets that would alert observers, no conspicuous weapons development programs that would trigger sanctions, just steady, quiet preparation using resources that already existed for other purposes. The Zerithian tactical assessment teams were looking at the most comprehensively defended planet they'd ever encountered, and they'd almost missed it because they were looking for the wrong indicators. So the Zerithians start counting what they're actually facing, and the numbers don't match their intelligence projections at all. Their initial scan showed roughly 3,000 orbital platforms where they'd expected maybe 24 proper military satellites and some civilian debris. The breakdown kept shifting as their sensor operators refined their analysis, discovering layered capabilities that weren't immediately apparent. About 800 platforms were armed for kinetic weapons, railguns, missile batteries, impactor systems that could throw asteroids with frightening precision. Another 400 carried directed energy systems ranging from high-energy lasers to particle beam weapons that could engage targets across astronomical distances. But the real surprise was the remaining 1,700 platforms that weren't weapons at all in the traditional sense. These formed an integrated targeting and sensor network that covered near-Earth space with overlapping coverage patterns. They were watching each other's blind spots, sharing targeting data, coordinating fire solutions across the entire orbital sphere. The system had redundant communication pathways, automated handoff protocols, and what appeared to be autonomous decision-making capacity for defense prioritization. Their tactical computers started flagging coordination patterns that suggested a level of integration they'd only seen in much more advanced civilizations. Here's what really unsettled them. Everything was connected in ways that defied their understanding of Earth's technological level. The orbital platforms were talking to ground installations, lunar research stations, Mars colonization outposts, even the mining operations in the asteroid belt. They detected constant data streams flowing between what should have been separate civilian and scientific operations, all contributing to this single defensive consciousness. A weather satellite in geostationary orbit was feeding atmospheric data to a kinetic weapon platform that needed to adjust for atmospheric distortion. A Mars rover was providing planetary alignment data to targeting computers. The entire solar system was acting like one giant sensory organ. This wasn't a collection of separate defenses that could be picked off individually. The Zerithian tactical planners kept looking for command nodes, critical infrastructure, high-value targets that would collapse the system if eliminated. What they found was a distributed network with no single point of failure, capable of rerouting commands and reassigning functions automatically. Destroying one platform just caused 3 others to assume its responsibilities. Damaging a communications hub resulted in the network shifting to backup laser links or even bouncing signals off atmospheric layers. The system had more redundancy and adaptability than anything in their own military doctrine. It was a single firing and sensing web that covered the entire solar system with no gaps in coverage. Their invasion fleet found itself looking at a defensive grid that could track them from multiple angles simultaneously, calculate firing solutions using distributed computing across thousands of platforms, and coordinate attacks that would come from unexpected vectors. The Martian installations could provide early warning of approach trajectories. The asteroid belt stations could launch interceptors from completely unexpected directions, and the lunar bases could coordinate countermeasures that would make any bombardment attempt extremely costly. Their tactical picture shifted from overwhelming force to potential trap within hours of detailed analysis. The intelligence reports that had described Earth as primitive and technologically backward now seemed like deliberate misinformation. The comfortable assumption of military superiority began feeling like arrogance in the face of this completely unexpected defensive capability. Their invasion plan had been built around quickly establishing orbital superiority. But orbital superiority meant nothing against a system that didn't rely on controlling orbital space in the traditional sense. How had they missed this level of coordination? From what their briefings called a primitive civilization, their intelligence gathering had focused on visible military assets, government spending on defense, traditional indicators of military power. They'd completely missed the distributed nature of Earth's defense approach because it was woven into the fabric of their civilian infrastructure and scientific endeavors. The coordination emerged from decades of collaborative research projects, international space agreements, and shared technological development that looked like peaceful cooperation, but had military applications built into every component. Their assessment teams were looking at the most sophisticated planetary defense system they'd ever encountered, and they'd completely failed to see it coming because they were looking for the wrong things entirely.